Absolutely. Let's do it.
Welcome everybody. My name is Marcel Dijs. I'm Chief CBAM Officer of Dubrink, and today we are here with John from MEPS International. It's kind of interesting how John and I got to know each other because John, you were in Birmingham at UK Metals, I remember, and you invited me for a game of what do you call that? Guacamole, I think.
I had to. Yes.
Yeah, guacamole.
It was a little toy on the stand.
Exactly. And I had to hit on some buttons because there were lights popping up and I needed to hit them as fast as I could. However, after 3 or 4 buttons, I started to realize that there was blood on the buttons. And the more I started to hit them, the more blood there was. And I think I was eventually the only one on this trade show that didn't finish his game of guacamole because I somehow managed to hurt myself. But it actually was a conversation starter. And now here we are for a webinar between Dubrink and MEPS, and I'm actually looking myself very much forward to combine your insights together with the Jan Joost insights on CBAM. Thank you for joining, and I for now give the stage to Jan Joost. Enjoy, everybody.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, everyone. So today's topic is obviously what the steel industry needs to know. My part will primarily speak a little bit about compliance, and then the idea is to hand over to John, who will speak a little bit more about the cost, because obviously that is the expertise of MEPS. That being said, quick housekeeping, perhaps. I plan to speak for about 15-20 minutes, then we'll hand over the mic to John, and then I would very much like to go into Q&A. We received quite a few questions ahead of time. And of course, if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to ask them. The way to do that, let me see. Yeah, the way to do that is to head over to the look. It says a triangle, square, circle. It's actually 9 dots now. It has been changed. Head over there, please, and then press on either polls to answer some of the questions that we will ask you, or a Q&A. This is what polls look like, and if you are answering questions, use the Q&A button, and the only thing you have to do, which would be a kind request from our side, if you have a question that somebody else has already asked, please just upvote the question rather than asking it again, because it allows us to kind of see what's a more popular question than others, basically. Then you can also actually add subtitles to this call if you would like to receive, let's say, real-time subtitles. You can press the CC button, and then the next thing you can do is you can head over to this little cogwheel on the right-hand side, translated captions, and this is actually how you can translate whatever we say in real time, which should help if you're not a native speaker. That being said, my name is Jan Joost de Brinker, or JJ is a little easier. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Dubrink. I'm also on the board of the International Association, where I'm currently the Vice President. And I speak quite a bit about CBAM, of course, primarily as my role as Chief Technology Officer in Dubrink. I speak with lots of our clients about CBAM, about the technical part. We deal also with a lot of customs representatives. But of course, steel importers is the largest sector that is hit by CBAM, at least by volume. So in this sense, I think we have quite a lot of common ground that we can talk about. If you want to get a hold of me, I will send out this presentation at a later point. Here's my email address, and feel free to just send me an email. About Dubrink, perhaps. So we are a CBAM company. We offer, of course, consultancy, a little bit of education, and we have a best-in-class platform. Our consultancy is really focused on things like risk or strategy and how to navigate the complex regulation, whereas the educational component is much more about this, right? Where we take a topic and we walk you through it. And in this case, it would be CBAM costs, but we also have done things about authorized declarants or potentially about risk management and so forth. And then perhaps our platform, which is the cornerstone of our offering. It's a platform that allows you to exchange CBAM data. It's available in 27 languages. We have over 1,500 companies in the EU using it to date. And we really try to make CBAM as simple as possible for you as an EU importer, or potentially UK importer, of course, when UK CBAM comes around. That being said, the way it works, you simply send data requests to your suppliers. We have a larger and larger network of suppliers, of course, because of the network effect. More people join, and every time you send a data request to your suppliers, they can simply just create that, calculate everything in our platform, and then send it back to you. We will receive the data, we will validate it, and of course, return it to you, and you can then generate what's called a one-click declaration, which saves you quite a bit of time, and you can always declare, both for customs representatives, of course, as well as importers. That being said, I think it's time to talk about today's topic. The first thing is I'll give you a very, very brief policy update, quick timeline. I want to talk about the authorized declarant process, and not just the process itself, but also some of the learnings that we have done over the course of the past few months. And then I would very much like to speak about data collection, and then we head over to MEPS. Great. So as you may have seen, a lot of people were concerned about whether CBAM would still continue. The implementation will continue as planned. The EU has confirmed this. We've also seen, interestingly enough, that deforestation has been delayed by another year due to IT concerns. Now, some of the underlying systems used for CBAM and EUDR are the same, but despite that, the EU Commission has said that there is no delay to CBAM. So in the matter of 3 months' time, CBAM is really here. And that is obviously confirmed because we just received the final vote on the omnibus regulation, which really pushed the threshold to 50 tons. But now it's fully official, and there's very little that will change about that. Then, as far as the timeline, we are currently, like I said, this is a slightly older slide, but it's October 21st. I am aware of that. We are about 3 months away from CBAM. In 2026, it is only authorized declarants, or those who have the authorized declarant status in progress, the request procedure, that will be able to import / custom clear materials in 2026. You will be required to purchase certificates in February of 2027, and then eventually in August, on August 31st in 2027, you will have to file the final declaration. About that authorized declarant, this is a formal request procedure, and it's a risk assessment. So it looks at things like import volumes, financials, as well as your current track record. No one wrote in any of the legislative documents that it is mandatory to have had a perfectly clean track record. Yeah, it was not necessary to necessarily submit all the historical reports in the current transitional registry. But I'll show you some examples in just a second about some of the real life experiences that we have had with this procedure for some of our clients. Another thing is that there is 120 days evaluation period. So the national competent authorities, they have 120 days to evaluate. Countries like Belgium have said that if you submit it before the end of the month, you can still gain access by January. They've also said that if you have the authorization in progress, then all throughout Q1, imports should not be halted. So keep these few things in mind. It's also quite important to make a forecast on import quantities. And one of the things that we see now is that the national competent authorities are really taking this serious once it exceeds the threshold of, let's say, 2,000 tons. So once you declare 2,000 tons of material is what you're going to bring in, keep in mind that now they're going to pay extra scrutiny to everything else that you have filled out. And that really matters. Lastly, if you're not authorized and we're no longer in Q1 of 2026, then there will be no imports possible. Then some of the learnings, perhaps. So we have received quite a few companies that are, for example, one-man shows or two-man shows, very, very few people dealing with CBAM. They receive questions from the government, from the national competent authorities. Are you capable of handling CBAM? How are you going to manage your certificates? How are you going to manage it operationally? Show us evidence that you can do that. Obviously, for our clients, we set up a proof letter to really show that using our platform, you can essentially remove a lot of these or meet a lot of these requirements, but keep it in mind. It's also important to note that the procedure is not open in all EU member states just yet. Romania opened the procedure back in March of this year, but Poland is still not open. And some of the reasons behind this is, for example, in Poland, they're not sure if it's the customs or the environmental office that should take responsibility for the request procedure. So they're kind of fighting about that. And as a result, the process is just on hold. Another thing that we see is that, sorry, I realized that it's overlapping with my picture, but many more documents are typically requested than initially written down in the legislation. For example, proof of ownership of the company, extraction, like extracts of, who's the ultimate beneficiary owner, stuff like this. And we also see a lot of scrutiny on past reports, like I said. For example, and I actually added another screenshot of that. This is translated from an email I received in Romanian, and that's basically that the customer added historical reports into the transitional registry, and they cross-check this against customs. So we see, whatever, 500 tons custom cleared, but in the CBAM reports that you filed, it's only 490 tons. And it was really that, little of a difference. We're not talking about thousands of tons of unreported material. We're really talking about a couple of tons that essentially were misclassified because, it was like December and they reported that in January or vice versa. So small difference. And they basically said, okay, just do the whole procedure again because everything must match the records that we have on file in customs. Among our customer base for whom we have done the authorized declarant process, we see a small percentage of acceptance so far. The biggest pushback we receive from the authorities is really on the fact that you are a one-man show, you're a two-man show. We're not certain that you will be able to financially carry the burden of CBAM, right? These are the typical kind of pushbacks that we get. Some of these can obviously be mitigated. You can prove operational excellence through, IS-CBAM 3002. It's a certification that shows you that shows to the authorities that you actually know what you're doing. Other ways could obviously be proof of hedging or stuff like this to show financial capabilities as well. But perhaps later, when we speak more about finances, we can talk about that as well. Then on the data collection side, typically what you will need to declare is direct emissions embedded in your goods. I'm asterisk here because it's not for every goods category. There are a few exceptions. For example, hydrogen and fertilizers, I believe, or cement and fertilizers, sorry. But the point is, you must find out this information, right? So you must go to your supply chain and ask them for these emissions. If emissions are not verified, that would essentially mean that you cannot use their emissions during the definitive period. The verification is still, to date, a crucial part of the legislation. There has not been any exceptions or whatsoever, even though nothing is ready yet in terms of these verification criteria. And one of the things that we can see in the legislation is that the default values may be used punitively. Now, the French National Competent Authority gave a webinar, I believe it was last week, and that's where they actually highlighted and they gave an example of what these punitive default values might actually look like. And what we're seeing to date is that it's going to be about 30% higher than the typical default values that we have for the transitional period. Now, this is not yet confirmed. Hopefully, by the end of this month, we should get a provisional list. But that being said, there is a lot of stuff still unknown, these being some of them. Then we are onto the best part of CBAM. Of course, it's a strong financial measure, and that's also where we decided to partner up with MMPS. And this is where I would actually like to invite John, perhaps, to take over.
Thank you very much.
Feel free to, you can just share your screen and it should replace.
Okay. Okay, so hopefully you can see the presentation slides there now.
It's your presenter screen for some reason. I'm not sure.
Okay, no problem. Let's go back one. I have my notes all written out as well, so we don't need to rely on the technology. Okay, so thank you very much, JJ. Thank you very much, Marcel, as well. Yes, I also really do remember that day that we met in Birmingham. It was probably the highlight of my few days there. Since meeting with Marcel, we've spoken with Dubrink quite a few times here at MEPS, and thought that it was the way the two companies are approaching CBAM are extremely complementary. So when Marcel suggested running through a webinar that's going to focus on the steel industry, I thought it was an absolutely fantastic idea. So just to give you a little bit of information about myself and about MEPS, I'm John Carruthers Green. I'm one of the steel market analysts here at MEPS International. And over the past couple of years, I've been focusing on compliance within CBAM. I've been looking at the other trade defense measures that are happening in Europe, and also sort of touching on sort of the green steel as a whole. For anybody out there who doesn't know MEPS International, we're a steel price analysis company, and we've been going now for about 45 years. It was started by our founder, Peter Fish, and what we do is we produce some publications that cover steel prices within Europe, within Asia, within North America, and as well as that, we also drill down just to provide steel pricing information as well. So one of the key aspects of the way that we do this is we're speaking directly with people in the industry. So this is how we've come to find out that sort of CBAM is the big concern. It's the topic that everybody's talking about during the monthly research calls that we have. And one of the big factors that we found is that everybody seems to have their own interpretation of CBAM. Everybody seems to have their own understanding. And so once again, when Dubrink suggested we did this webinar, I thought it was absolutely the very best idea. So I just want to run through a couple of bits that I'm going to cover today. And first of all, what I really want to do is address sort of some of the confusion around CBAM. A lot of this comes from the fact that the original guidance put out by the European Commission was very dense. It was a whole range of documents, each one relying on the other. And it really became very difficult to really understand and break down in simple terms what somebody has to do. So the first thing I want to do is address almost this wrong interpretation of CBAM costs. Then I want to move on to the European benchmarks. Now I'm going to spend probably the biggest chunk of my talk today covering the European benchmarks. And I think this was the one bit that everybody missed in that first sort of analysis of how much CBAM is going to cost us. And then want to move on to the other factors that make up the CBAM cost equation. There are several other factors that are going to be determining just how much it is that importers will be having to pay. And then, of course, I want to take one more step back after that and look at the other factors that are going to be affecting steel prices over 2026. CBAM is just one form of trade defense mechanism that's going to be applying to imports going into the EU. So I just want to touch on those as well. And then finally, I'd just like to give you a little bit of an outlook for what we expect prices to do in 2026. Our forecast team update these every month, and they've just put out their latest version for these forecasts. So I just want to give you you guys a quick run through of those. So I think a lot of this confusion comes around the poor communication from the European Commission. We were told back in 2023, just as we were going to move into the preliminary period, that there were going to be some big changes coming within CBAM. There was guidance put out that the EU ETS scheme, which is essentially the European version of CBAM, the one that covers emissions for steelmakers within Europe. At the same time, there was also this guidance put out, and there was indications that the carbon costs that were applied on European steelmakers were going to be gradually phased in. So in this first year, in 2026, European steelmakers would only have to pay for 2.5% of their carbon emissions. The rest of the paperwork that was sort of put out then sort of kind of indicated that CBAM payments would match this value. So CBAM would be phased in as the EU emission allowances were phased out. And then the other thing that really sort of complicated things was that the Commission also published default values at the same time, which gave us a whole string of numbers to play with. And what this meant was essentially there was very little guidance, and a lot of people were left to interpret their own understanding of this. So one of the charts that I've seen sort of quite frequently, you may have seen this before in a table, you may have seen this in the chart itself, but this blue line that's going down where essentially matches the ETS allowances and shows how they're being phased out. So essentially in that first year, European steelmakers would get 97.5% of their allowances. They would get to keep those. And as we go through the next 8 years, that would gradually be removed. And at the same time, the CBAM charge was being phased in. So in order to keep this level playing field, which is something that the Commission was very keen to highlight that it was doing, mainly so that it could be compliant with WTO regulations. The initial assumption was that in this first year, the CBAM charge would essentially be this 2.5% of the carbon cost. So a lot of people put this into the formula for working out their CBAM liabilities and kind of applied it incorrectly. So when we're looking at your actual liabilities, there are various factors which go into this calculation. First of all, being the amount of tons you're importing, the actual CO2 emissions tied to the product. Then people were removing this free allocation and working out a carbon price. So when we plugged these numbers in sort of the first time around, people were essentially discounting the vast majority of this of the carbon costs. And when we apply this to the carbon price that was paid, we're essentially, the assumption originally was that in 2026 we're only going to be paying around €5 as the CBAM liability. And I just want to make sure that everybody understands that this is the wrong interpretation. This is incorrect. Don't worry though. In a little bit later, I'll come on to cover the correct formula. So yes, this is wrong. There's a very fundamental part of the equation that's been missing, and the reason this was missing was because of this poor communication. It was only really when people dug into sort of the details of the document and read through sort of things like the FAQs that were being updated regularly, that people kind of finally understood that a key part that was missing was this European benchmark. So the European benchmark's the missing piece of the puzzle. What the European benchmark does, and the reason it's so important, is because this defines the minimum CO2 that's embedded in some steel. And what this does, this assumes, this figure is put out there assuming the CO2 emissions of the most efficient EU producers. So what it's really doing is it's setting that lowest baseline. What it's doing is trying to replicate the best-in-class emissions performances. The whole aim of CBAM is to provide another reason for people to reduce emissions. And by recovering this, the most efficient producers, there was an incentive for other steelmakers, for other suppliers to become more efficient. Now, these benchmarks are going to be set, are currently set via only sort of two methods. Currently, the ones that have been in place since 2021 up to 2025 only cover emissions from a blast furnace and from an electric arc furnace. What we also need to do to apply this to CBAM is to get benchmarks for the rest of the product categories. So just like we saw with the default values, benchmarks need to be set for hot rolled coil, cold rolled coil, and each one of the other product categories that's out there. And just to drill home why they're so important, if your emissions can be below this benchmark, you essentially have no CBAM liability. You have no liability for imports being brought into the EU. And conversely, for steelmakers in Europe, there'd be no charges under the ETS scheme. So with this setting that lower baseline, it's absolutely key that these benchmarks are being set. The problem is, we are now, where are we, 2.5 months before the definitive period is due to start. We're about 2.5 months before you guys are going to have to start paying for these emissions, and this information is still missing. So the information's missing fundamentally because the current benchmarks that are in place for blast furnaces and for electric arc furnaces have to be reassessed. The European Commission is currently in the process of doing this. But as we saw, as I mentioned a little earlier, there's a fundamental difference between the way the ETS scheme benchmarks work and how the CBAM benchmarks will work. So the European ones are essentially just covering these production methods. So there's one for blast furnaces and there's one for electric arc furnaces. But we've already found out that CBAM is essentially related to, essentially marked, and the costs are all determined on the CN or the HS codes. That's how the Commission's categorizing things. So essentially, there are hundreds more of these calculations that need to be completed. Now, the Commission's known this for quite some time. The Commission's known that this deadline's coming. This is a deadline they set themselves. But what they haven't been able to do is to get all this information in place. So what they currently estimate is that they're going to have these benchmarks ready by spring, mid-2026. I've heard sort of the end of Q1. Yes.
Sorry to jump in, John, but we received some questions. If you would be so kind to hide a little pop-up that says meet.google is sharing your screen. Is it possible to press hide?
Yeah.
Because it hit just the last point, you know.
Okay, so, sorry.
No, that's fine. Perfect. Thanks.
Okay, so so really what this means is that people know that they're about to hit CBAM. They know they're about to get these extra costs, but they don't know exactly how much they are. There is this fundamental, this sort of black hole of information. So the reason that the benchmark becomes really important is, as I say, it's going to determine exactly what this lower baseline is. And just to drill home the fact that this benchmark, this baseline, is essentially sort of the defining line between this clean technology and technology that's chargeable. So it's going to be really important. It's going to be really sort of fundamental to how much you're paying, exactly where this benchmark ends up. And essentially, I'm just going to flick back between the next few, the next slide or two, just to sort of indicate just exactly where it could be. So with this lack of information from the Commission, I've seen various steelmakers around Europe estimating a benchmark for hot rolled coil. I think the highest forecast I saw was about 1.8 tons of CO2 per ton of steel, pardon me. And the lowest was about 1.4 tons. So exactly where this does end up is going to be incredibly important to the amount of money that's being paid. If it's at this lower level, you could expect CBAM liabilities, the amount you're going to have to pay, to be higher. If it's at this higher level, then that would reduce the amount that you'd have to pay. As essentially everything that's below this line, everything that's below this benchmark, will be charged at this 2.5% in 2026, and everything above it at this 100% mark. So I think the easiest way to think of this is sort of like marginal tax rates. So exactly where this line ends up is going to be absolutely key for working out how much your liability will be in 2026. Unfortunately, as I say, that information hasn't been released yet. So benchmark, I think, is probably one of the most important parts of this equation. And certainly with this lack of information at the moment, it's the part I want to highlight. But it's not the only part of the equation. There are other factors that are going to affect just how much you're paying. Of course, the first one is going to be the emissions from your suppliers. Your suppliers will be asked to provide measurements. I hope you're certainly in the stage of doing that now. To provide actual measurements for their emissions, and if not, there are these default emissions. But as JJ indicated a little earlier, these default emissions are set. These default values are set quite high in order to incentivize people to start providing this site-specific information. So with the supplier emissions being sort of the first part, it really promotes this low CO2 production. So electric arc furnaces, certainly electric arc furnaces that are powered by renewables, will probably end up at the lower end of this. And if there is an incorporation of green hydrogen, certainly through either retrofitting some of the blast furnaces or using DRI, then that could also bring that value down from that sort of that standard from that level. Just very briefly, moving on to the European benchmarks. I've just talked about these, but essentially this sets that baseline for the charge. Another really important factor is, of course, going to be the EU carbon price. Now, the way that the Commission intends to apply this is that it's essentially going to match the EU ETS scheme. So what they're going to do is they're going to take the weekly average closing price of these ETS allowances and apply that price to the CBAM charge. Now, we'll see a little bit later that there is a little bit of play there available for importers. While there's this weekly closing price, they don't have to have all of their emissions covered each week. But essentially what we're going to see is these carbon costs fluctuate. I was just looking at some of the figures just ahead of this presentation, and we're currently looking at around about 80 euros per ton of CO2. But if you look back this chart, we've fluctuated between sort of 60 and 90 tons over this past year. And just in 2023, that peaked at 100 tons, 100 euros for a ton of CO2. So that's a very big variable that's going to affect just how much you end up paying. And then, of course, the final part of the equation there is this incentive for CBAM to be expanded to other countries. So I think one of the desires of using CBAM is that third countries, other countries, start applying carbon charges within their own markets. So what the Commission intends to do is to reduce the CBAM liabilities in line with any carbon that's paid for elsewhere. So if your CO2 emissions are paid for in the exporting country, then a corresponding amount will be reduced off the amount that the European Union's charging you. It's still very early days with this, though, and the guidance around exactly who is recognized, what's a verifiable method, this is all still sort of to be determined. But currently, there aren't really any schemes that I've seen that would get you any discounts at the moment. As I say, though, as we go on through the period, I fully expect that to change. So, just simply, I like to sort of just sum this up with the supplier emissions is essentially the starting point for how much you're going to be charged. The benchmark sets a baseline for these charges. The carbon price multiplies all of the amount that you'll be charged, and then the third country carbon cost is an adjustment factor. And then once we take all of those into account, we'll come up with your CBAM liability, the result. Okay, so let's look at that formula again, applying what we know now rather than the incorrect assessment that sort of prevailed in the market for the past few years. So once again, it's a very, very similar formula, but when we apply some of the default values that we've seen published, when we apply the correct European benchmark, when we apply the current ETS price, then we'll find out that our charge. Now, currently, with this European benchmark being estimated, the best I can do is to give you a range for exactly how much you would be charged for a ton of hot rolled coil brought in. But if we apply those benchmarks and we take that correct amount off, we're ending up with something closer to around 45 to 75 euros for a ton of steel that's being applied there. So that's much, much higher than this €5 estimate that was prevalent only sort of a year or two ago. Unfortunately, though, this is not going to be. Sorry. Before I go on to that, let's just have a look exactly when these charges will be realised, as there is sort of two distinct stages to how these CBAM certificates, these CBAM liabilities, are dealt with. And essentially it means that you're going to have to keep track of this quarterly, but then there will also be that sort of annual accounting, annual assessment that'll need to be done. So in order to remain compliant with the measures, you will need to hold certificates equaling 50% of your assessed embedded emissions. Now, this will start from 2027, simply because there isn't quite the systems in place currently to do this in 2026. There isn't the information in place to do this now. And as JJ mentioned again, with the omnibus simplifications just coming through in the past few days. We found that's now 50% of the embedded emissions, down from 80%. And once again, those certificates are going to be linked to the ETS market. As I said before, the weekly price is going to change, but you will only have to complete that assessment and file that report by the end of the quarter. So there is that leeway there to look at this, look at the timing of those purchases. So once you've purchased those certificates, you'll need to surrender those certificates, and this is the annual part of things. So the annual declarations that are that happen are where you surrender the certificates, and that's completed. Sorry, that started in May the following year and completed in August. Any outstanding certificates over and above the ones that you purchased to maintain your quarterly compliance must be purchased and surrendered. So what this essentially means is that you're going to have this ongoing financial impact to deal with, and there'll be that purchasing at the point of purchase, and then at the point of surrendering, if depending on just how many certificates you're holding during that period. But as I started to say before, CBAM is not going to be the only charge that's going to be coming up for importers next year. We also see that there is an abundance now of anti-dumping and countervailing tariffs that are they're in the process of being applied. So within the EU, we've just recently seen anti-dumping duties applied to hot rolled coil coming from several countries, and there's an investigation just being launched for cold rolled coil. We've seen with sort of the overcapacity issues in Asia that it's not just Europe that are increasing their application of anti-dumping and countervailing investigations and tariffs. This is happening globally. I think 2024 was previously the record for the number of new investigations announced globally, and 2025 has already beaten that. So we come into this era of even greater trade defence. Secondly, adding another potential barrier or another potential cost is in just the past few days, we've seen the European Commission propose their replacement for the EU safeguards. So under WTO rules, the safeguards were only allowed to remain in place for 8 years, which means they would expire in July 2026. Sorry, on June 30th, 2026. And there has been a lot of pressure from European steelmakers to apply something else when they expire. Now, the lobbying from the European steelmakers has been pretty intense, and it seems like that has been successful. The proposed replacement is going to be much more stringent than the current measures. Proposed replacement essentially halves the current quota volumes that are being applied under the safeguard measures. What it also does is the proposal suggesting doubling tariffs from the 25% that they currently stand at to 50%. Now, I don't think this 50% number was arrived at entirely by accident. I think the one small positive that we can take from this is that with the tariffs in the US, with the tariffs in Canada, with these tariffs potentially in Europe and also in the UK landing at 50%, I think there's room for some kind of global alignment. There are ongoing talks about how to deal with overcapacity issues, and I think this assessment, this setting at 50% just eases us slightly closer towards some kind of global agreement. Then, of course, there's CBAM. The costs are going to be applying from January 1st. And while there is a little bit of a reprieve until mid-2027 for these certificates to be surrendered, the costs will be there, and you will have to keep track of those, and you will be expected to keep on top of that. So there are a lot more restrictions to steel supply that will be applying from next year. This means essentially steel mills in Europe are going to have less competition, buyers are going to have fewer options, and this supply or this reduction in supply is going to apply huge upward pressure throughout Europe. So what I just want to finish off doing is just giving you just a quick glimpse at some of the forecasts that our team put together. And I'll just start by explaining sort of where we are now. In 2025, we saw quite a strong rise in the sort of the first quarter of the month, falling again as we hit summer. What we've seen in the past month or two is it looks like we might be getting to a little bit of a recovery. It looks like the hot rolled coil prices have already started rising. The rebar, which as we can see has been just a little bit weaker there, that could also be on the turn. We're beginning to see much more resistance from mills accepting any price cuts. We're seeing buyers struggling to get discounts. So for this hot rolled coil, we're kind of expecting this to rise ever so slightly by the time we hit December. The problem is, the thing that's holding this back is that essentially there's very weak demand throughout Europe. Germany in particular is suffering, and with it being the largest steel maker in Europe, with it being one of the strongest economies, the downturn that we've seen there has been significant, not just for Germany itself, but for the European region as a whole. What we're also seeing is more and more talk of importers being worried about these CBAM costs that are being applied as of January. Delivery lead times now mean that orders placed now will come smack bang in the middle of that first quarter, maybe even a little bit later. Any orders placed now for imports into the EU will pick up that charge, and people don't understand. People don't know what that charge is going to be. So that's really stopped a lot of these imports coming in. We saw a little bit of a peak, probably around about late August, September, for these imports, or for these orders, which would be delivered in hopefully in December, time to be cleared before CBAM charges apply. But we've also, like I say, we've also seen the people holding back on making these orders now. As I say, this lack of demand within Europe has really sort of kept a lid on any price rises. But now, looking a little bit further forward, I'm just going to show you our forecasts for the next 12 months. We're expecting some strong increases in prices, both for hot rolled coil and for rebar. I've chosen these as they're the most sort of indicative flat and long products, but a lot of the other products follow very similar trends. We're expecting prices to grow steadily, grow strongly, in fact, throughout the first half of 2026. Currently expecting them to peak at around about 675 euros. And as I say, a lot of this early rise is due to this uncertainty around the CBAM costs. And with that uncertainty, we're expecting steel mills in Europe to push their prices up in response. We've already seen some of the larger steel mills already pushing for increases this month. Some of those have been accepted, not quite at the level that the mills will have hoped. But we're expecting to see a lot more of this throughout the first half of 2026. What we're also seeing is world steel estimates for steel demand within Europe. They're expected to increase within Europe by about just over 3%, which is very healthy compared to the past few years. So these two factors are really going to be sort of the key part of driving this rise. What we're expecting, though, is as we hit summer, as we hit sort of the traditional quieter period for the industry, as supply chains begin to adjust, we're expecting to see those price rises drop off. But as you can see from the chart, the prices there are likely to end up still a whole lot higher than where we are currently. What we're also currently doing is we know that there's demand within the industry for longer term forecasts. So these 12-month forecasts are available to people purchasing products on our portal, and they're now being introduced to our publications as well. We're also currently working on updating our steel price outlook. That's a publication which provides longer term forecasts. So if anybody needs price analysis for up to 5 years, then that's certainly one of the products to look at. So I hope that gives you some kind of indication of the factors that are affecting steel prices. The factors from CBAM that are going to be affecting the price, and then also understand now that how CBAM is just going to be one part of the challenge that we're going to see in 2026. So with that, I'm going to end my presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you, John. We actually have quite a few questions. They are perhaps not as much related to your presentation, because there were a few, but you answered them in the presentation. So
okay,
I think
good.
that solved itself. One of the questions that came in is, and I think it's because maybe the person who asked the question joined a little bit later, it's about the fact that not every AMM or CBAM authorized declarant procedure is, every country is open just yet. And that is indeed the case. We know that in Poland, like I said in the beginning, customs and environmental office are fighting on who's to take responsibility for the procedure. So unfortunately, this is the case. Most other countries are open, at least the ones that we are active in, which is not all member states. There might be like Malta or something, but I generally think that Poland is the outlier here. And then I received, you mentioned, I saw it once or twice, you said that it would be that it is based on, it's about the ETS price. So in 2026, the price will not be linked to the EU ETS, it will be the quarterly price of the quarter in which you custom clear, which was actually pointed out by Saul, and he also answered a few other questions. Thank you very much, Saul. We know you're always on top of things, so that's really appreciated. So yes, the price, EU ETS price of the quarter in which you custom clear will be leading for 2026, and for 2027 it will be indeed the weekly average price of custom clearance, which will be used for the which will be used as the base price. And then I see a couple other questions come in. That is maybe something that you might know something about. So the question is, how do you differentiate between a life cycle assessment on one hand and the relevant emissions under CBAM on the other? The life cycle assessment would be more conservative, and could it be more reliable than the default values? Do you have any thoughts on that?
On that side of things, no, that's not really something we.
I can share maybe my
too much detail
experience with it. So I have seen both life cycle assessments and CBAM emissions sent to us for the same product, and they differ quite a bit, and it has to do with the scope. So certain things are included in the life cycle assessment that may or may not be included in the CBAM scope. That's obviously the biggest point of concern. And I think CBAM is actually more inclusive than the life cycle assessment in this case. At least the product that I'm thinking of had lower emissions on the life cycle assessment than it did for CBAM. So unfortunately, the rule is like this: you use CBAM methodology, and then get that verified, or you don't use that, and then it's default values. Lifecycle assessments are currently not one of the recognized or allowed methodologies that you can use to calculate the emissions on the supplier side. They are working on this. It's obviously a big concern. There are other standardized methods in the industry, not just iron and steel, but for example, aluminium as well, where it would actually make sense to be able to use these other product carbon footprint or life cycle assessment type things. Unfortunately, the legislation has not yet caught up with that. We know that it is one of the things that they're investigating, but again, it will unfortunately take a little bit more time. And then we see a few more questions. Yeah, that's actually for you, John. So what is the rationale for price to reduce in H2 2026?
Okay, so for the second half of 2026, it's the same kind of seasonality that we're seeing pretty much every year. Now it's being tempered a lot more, I think this year, as we saw with CBAM being introduced, with potential safeguards increasing, the decline in the industry, the slowdown we see over the summer, that fall in demand that we tend to see in the second half of the year, that's really driving that.
Okay. And then let me see. So I'm just going to read the question. Asking for a friend from 2026, for which goods, aluminium, steel, fertilizer, hydrogen, cement, electricity, do we need to include indirect emissions? And as far as I know, top of my head, it's fertilizers and cement that include both direct and indirect emissions, and all the other ones only report direct emissions. Then there's a question which is about the timing of the certificates, I guess. So there is a rule on the surrendering of the CBAM certificates. Can I choose which certificate to surrender, or do I need to proceed in order? I need to know this in order to manage the cost and optimize the wallet. So the way we understand it is that there will be a dimension of time associated with the certificates. The reason I'm saying that is because there is an expiry date on these certificates. That means that if you buy a certificate in, don't worry about the year. Let's say you buy that in January of year one, and you buy a secondary certificate or a couple of certificates in January year two, then after a few years, 3 years to my knowledge, that certificate would expire, the one that you buy in year one, whereas the other one has a year delay. So there must be a dimension of time, and probably that dimension of time will also be related to price, because of course there will be 4 prices in 2026 and potentially 52 prices in 2027. That's the average price of the quarter versus the average price of the week. So I think you will be able to optimize a little bit there, but if you're really looking to improve your financial exposure to CBAM, I think managing the certificates within your EU CBAM account is probably not the way. You probably would do that outside of it, potentially hedging that, and then after unhedging it to bring it into, let's say, your CBAM account. That's probably what's a more common way to do it, because essentially it's an account in which the money just sits, right? So once it's in the EU account, it's no longer in your control. I think that's the main takeaway. The presentation will be available after this meeting, so I will send it out in a little time, and we'll also publish the recording online. Unfortunately, without the Q&A, that's typically how we do things. But if you have some specific questions, just feel free to reach out. Then there are some questions. So should the suppliers begin to calculate the carbon price in their reports? Most of them submit only the emissions data. I think the answer to that is that it does not make that much sense just yet, because in order for the carbon price paid at origin to be allowed to be included, the EU must first recognize these emission trading systems abroad. There are strict rules on that. For example, a hard limit, an absolute cap. We know that the UK has that. We know that the EU has that, but not many other places in the world have that. Those are the type of criteria that the EU is looking at. So for the moment, it's not really in scope. That's also why we typically put that at 0 in our forecasts, because there is just no carbon price paid to be considered just yet. I think suppliers have a very hard time calculating the emissions to begin with. Then the carbon price paid is going to come in. It's going to make things even more complicated. So for the moment, I would say, as it's not needed on the EU side or not supported on the EU side, don't overwhelm them too much. And then what are the officially recognized verifiable pricing systems available for deductions? So those would be officially recognized by the EU. And that's obviously not the case just yet. My personal belief is that the first one to be recognized would probably be the UK, because you have a very similar system. We were one union at some point. So that's probably one of the first ones, and then we're going to have to see what's going to be happening here.
Yeah, just to add to that, there are talks going on at the moment between the EU and the UK to align this ETS scheme. I believe they're still fairly early days, but with the UK looking to introduce their own CBAM system in 2027, the hope from both parties is that they get a lot of this across the line before then.
And I have another question. I think this one's quite interesting for you as well. So it's someone whose steel mill produces cold roll using hot roll from Indonesia. And how do we clarify and report CBAM until the melt origin? Do you have any idea how that would work?
Sorry, say that one again, please.
So our steel mills produce cold rolled material using hot rolled material from Indonesia. How do we clarify and report CBAM until melt origin?
So I believe with it being the hot roll coil, that's essentially the baseline for what you're reporting.
That's the melt and pour origin, I believe. Yeah, so that's where it would essentially start, and then under CBAM, I think you would report the cold rolling potentially just as a process.
So I suppose yes, it depends where the question is located.
Makes sense. Okay. And then, sorry, there's so many questions coming in that I have a bit of a hard time trying to navigate which ones have been answered. So if importers declare real emission values, will they be considered without verification, or should they be verified before February 2027? Or everyone would use default values and given time till February to prove the real values? I believe that as we have still 1 year, all of 2026, for the verification to be completed, I think it will be possible to use verified emissions. Basically, you can get the verification done until February 2027. I don't think every emission will be verified because there's just simply not enough capacity in the verifiers world to do that. I think I've said that before, but yeah. Generally, what we're saying, verification is the only way you can use actual values. So that's that. Then let me check. What if I import 101.5 tons of CO2? Will I have to buy 102 CBAM certificates? I think the answer to that is yes, because there's no such thing as half certificates. There are no such things as half EUAs. So it should mimic that, and I think they will round. That's actually one of the variables that's missing in this whole formula, because you get the number of certificates, you actually have to round that up to the nearest integer, or whole number, and then because there's no half certificates, I guess. But that's a relatively small part of the cost equation, I believe, the rounding up. Okay. Let me check. So is it possible to have a copy of the presentation? Okay, I already answered that, sorry. Benchmarks would be on each CN code whenever they are announced. Do you have any thoughts on how the benchmarks will be defined, John?
Yeah, this is I think the whole reason for them being delayed quite so long is because essentially the system we have in place now has two benchmarks. And there's one for hot metal produced in a blast furnace, and there's one for hot metal produced in electric arc furnace. And converting those and extending those and calculating the emissions for each one of the subsequent processes is the bit that's taking time. So yes, I fully expect there to be benchmarks for each one of the HSCN codes. Yeah.
Okay. This may be a silly question, but once all the complicated calculations have been made to calculate CBAM, when is it payable? Is it immediately on clearance? And that is still that is quite clear. It's not going to be on clearance. It's always going to be by September of essentially the year after the goods have been custom cleared, but the price will be based on the week in which the goods were custom cleared. I hope that makes sense. What is the pricing criteria for the certificates? Do we know in advance how much the CBAM certificate will cost? I guess we don't. That's one of the big unknowns, besides the benchmarks and potentially the default values. There are forecasts, of course, about the EUA. But yeah, this is the big unknown, how much the certificate eventually is going to cost. Oh, there was a question, but then it jumped, and now I don't see it anymore. Unanswered. Okay, sorry, I'm just gonna mark some of them, and this was answered already. Okay, and then will the default values be based on country level provided as be provided as well, or should we use the 30% in general? I mean, so the 30% is first of all unconfirmed about that. That's just one of the numbers that the French National Competent Authority highlighted in a recent webinar. The reason that we take that quite serious has to do with the fact that, you know, they're a very important player within the CBAM world. They're very closely connected to Brussels. Therefore, they usually get the information that matters or that is most accurate faster. That's just generally how it works. So there are special provisions within the legislation that allow for default values to be defined on country level or region level. It's not stated that that would happen, though. It's just, it's potentially possible. So I can't tell you if it's going to be or if it's not. I can just say that we saw 30%. We asked how this information was calculated or whatever, and I said, well, this is what we heard from the European Commission, but until we get the provisional list, there's not much we can do but speculate. Okay. Is there confirmation from the EU about the accepted ETS systems applied in extra EU, I guess in non-EU countries? Is South Korea confirmed? So this is going back to the previous question, that basically no other EU ETS systems, or sorry, emission trading systems are currently accepted. Okay, so while not having a benchmark at the moment, how would you define one as long as none is available? Would you recommend an efficiency factor as used within the EU ETS regulation and define assumptions based on the default values plus 30% minus efficiency factor? I mean, that's that's generally that's quite the whole benchmarks thing is going to determine whether CBAM will be punitive and very costly, or if it's actually just, you know, if it's a small percentage of the import, or if it's going to be a substantial part. So the benchmark is really the #1 variable, and to just we have no idea how they're going to define the CBAM benchmarks besides basing that on EU ETS benchmarks and then correlating it to production processes.
And I think it's also just to add, I think it's very clear that in European steelmakers don't know either. So I was at a conference recently, watching a few presentations by some of the biggest names, and I think the most interesting part was the few slides on everybody's presentation where they put their own estimate in for what the benchmark was going to be. And as I mentioned during the talk, we've seen figures as low as 1.4 tons. We saw figures as high as 1.8. So at the moment, there really isn't, without this guidance, without this clarity from the Commission, then the numbers really could end up anywhere. And as you say, what's the intention from the Commission? Is it to make this something that everybody can comply with, or is this to really crack down? And I think they've got to consider if they're looking to expand or apply pressure for getting some kind of global or regional carbon prices, then that's really got to be considered in this.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Just to confirm, if one supplier emissions have not been verified by February 27 because of lack of availability of verifiers, then the default values will have to be applied. Is this correct? So my understanding is to date that if emissions are not verified, you cannot use actual values. Whatever the reason for that is, sickness of the verifier, unavailability of the personnel on the supplier side, whatever the reason for that might be, generally is beyond the point. It's about verified emissions, actual unverified default. That's essentially how we explain that. So yes, your understanding is correct. Okay, and then any thoughts if there would be a demand for supplier discounts as a result of CBAM costs? John? Yeah.
Yes. Sorry, just unmuting. Yes, I can see that this will become a very important part of pricing, a very important part that isn't quite clear yet from the steel industry, is exactly where these charges are going to be incorporated. Will it be within the base price that's essentially is the price that's negotiated, or will this be included as an extra? The people that we've been speaking to, there seems to be a range of opinion within the buyers, and then also within some of the mills that we speak to, as to exactly how this will be applied. So once the sort of the market kind of determines where that's going to be, I think that's only really when we'll find out whether this is up for negotiation. But my opinion is that we're probably going to see this, certainly to begin with, as an additional surcharge. So I think to begin with, we're probably going to try and exclude this. Certainly remember that steel mills are going to use CBAM, use the uncertainty around CBAM to drive prices up. They're going to take this as an opportunity to recover some of their margins. So on the whole, I think we're going to see this as an extra, the same way we see for, say, sizing and coatings and energy. And as such, I think it's probably going to be excluded from any negotiations, certainly to begin with.
We see on the downstream side of things that some clients are putting that on their invoices now. This is actually wrong. They were advised by the national competent authorities in the Netherlands to only include 2.5%, exactly to the point that John made earlier, right? But we do see it already appearing on invoices left and right. Like, keep in mind, we're gonna charge you for CBAM. That's more for consumers, right? So that's after you've imported, but we do see this trend emerging. Yeah. Okay, then I think we have like 2 more questions, and then we can call it a day. If we end up with a surplus of CBAM certificates after surrendering the required amount, what will be done with the excess, and at what price can we be reimbursed? So you can give back or sell back the certificates that you have purchased. I believe you can sell up to 1/3 back, but then also they have an expiry date of, I believe, 2 or 3 years. This is something I don't have that front and center, but you can just use it for the next declaration. But if you really don't need them anymore because you're not going to import, you could sell back a substantial amount of it, up to 1/3. But don't buy loads of them if you're not going to use them. That's also where the forecasting comes in, I guess. But really keep that in mind. And then if we're buying hot rolled coil, so if we buy hot and cold rolled coils only from European steel mill, how does CBAM affect their prices?
Okay, so I think there's 2 parts to that. First of all, there is the actual effect. So the actual effect is going to be as CBAM's ramped up, the emissions allowances that steelmakers in Europe are receiving are going to be sort of cut at the exact same manner. So essentially, we're going to see in 2026, we're going to see steelmakers have to pay for a small proportion of their carbon. That's going to ramp up each year until 2034, until that's going to be fully incorporated within their cost structure. The other part is going to be the reduced supply. As I mentioned earlier, we're already seeing a lot of uncertainty, a lot of hesitancy, a lot of orders being delayed because of CBAM. And I think that other part is going to be really key for price movements in the next few months. It's going to be steelmakers in Europe trying to take advantage of that, of CBAM being here to increase prices and increase margins.
All right. I think that's plenty enough from our side. Thank you very much, John, for this conversation.
Thank you. I learned a lot today.
We spoke on this yesterday, but we will for sure be in touch. And if anything interesting comes up, we would be delighted to host a similar session again.
Yes, I thought Metz and Dubrink made a perfect fit with the bits of information you can bring and the bits of information we can.
Absolutely. Okay. Anyone who wants to know a little bit more about what Dubrink does, if you want to get in touch with us, feel free to schedule a meeting free of charge and with no commitment, just to learn more. Of course, MEPS can also help you with your compliance, with your any material intelligence or commodity intelligence that essentially you need. John and his team are very capable, happy to tell you more about what they do and how they can potentially assist. Marcel, anything from your side?
Yeah, if I may add one thing, if John is okay with that, at the end of the day, we will send the recording to all the people that signed up for the webinar.
Yes, please. Yeah, that'd be great. Also, we know that there are a lot of people that haven't been able to make it today because of the conference Euroblack Expo. I can never remember which one this year, going on in Germany at the moment. So if we could also make that available on your platform, I'll share that link with everybody who wasn't able to make it today.
Yeah, perfect. Sounds good.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank everyone for attending, and have a nice day.